Welcome, GitKon attendees. My name is Matt Johnston. I am the CEO of GitKraken, and I'm really excited to be joined today by CTO and co-founder of HubSpot, Dharmesh Shah. Dharmesh, thanks for sitting down with us.
Thanks for having me.
I'd love to start just by hearing your origin story. I've known you, by the time I got to know you a bit, you were already at HubSpot, and HubSpot was really starting to build something and starting to take off. But where did you grow up? Where did you study? And then where did your passion for, coding and building come from?
I was born in a small town in India. And small town in India is like, it was 50,000 people, but, no hospital. And, growing up, my high school had exactly 0 computers. Then I went to undergrad engineering school, 1,000 plus students. And I think we had 6 computers across the entire university at the time I was doing undergrad. And the amount of time I spent on any of those 6 computers was exactly 0. I never got to touch a single one because the ratio was so high.
Undergrad?
This is undergrad, engineering school too. This is undergrad. And so it just, it's one of those things, and it's I don't regret that, but it does kind of bug me a little bit because I got a late start, right? And then my kind of falling in love moment with computers and software development happened. I was visiting, from India, visiting my parents who happened to be here in Indiana, and Purdue University had a campus near where my parents were, and people had always told me, it's like, oh, you like mathy stuff, you should check out this computer stuff. That's all I sort of knew, right. And so Purdue had like a summer course on like introduction to computers, which is basically like a DOS operating system class, and an introduction to programming class that summer. And I took both of them, and I remember like sitting down for the first time, just going through the DOS thing. And this is the I'm going to date myself, which I'm completely comfortable with because the universe has dated me already, so that's it's not a big deal. But I remember sitting down, I'm like, this makes sense. So there was this kind of DOS operating manual there. That's like the reference manual for all the commands you can type into the operating system. And I read the whole thing back to back, and then it's like, and from that moment, I sort of knew that this is the thing I was like meant to do. I mean, it was really that epiphany moment, to the degree that I was just visiting for the summer, visiting my parents. I had planned to go back and finish up my engineering undergrad in India, and didn't go back. Enrolled in computer science undergrad at Purdue, and said, okay, this is what I'm doing. I'm all in, and like hadn't brought any of my stuff, hadn't said goodbye to my friends, didn't do any of that. Like this is the thing, and so have not looked back. It's been 30 plus years now.
Well, I was just going to ask, what would it, if you had gone back? I was going to say, boy, did you go through withdrawal after getting like your first real exposure and your first real, like that's what was meant for me. But you didn't even have to go through withdrawal. You just said, no, that's what's meant for me. And
that's what's meant for me. Yeah. I don't know that I could have stood once like I saw the light, so to speak, or saw the opportunity. And I didn't even think of it as an opportunity. I just thought of it as like this clicks for me, right? It's going to sound cliche, but it's like, falling in love with your kind of, with your partner. It's like, okay, like I sort of knew like early on, like there's something here. So anyway.
Yeah, it just made sense. And it's
sense.
Really cool when what you're describing to me, the word that comes to mind is calling, right? Yeah. It's I didn't find a career, I found a calling. Like this is what I was put here to do.
Yep.
Very, very cool. The two things that jump out to me there, one, you mentioned getting a late start. And I think oftentimes, especially, in kind of modern times, always connected, social media, able to compare myself in real time to everyone else. It's easy to say like, well, I got a late start, so why bother? Yeah. And you're living proof and coding proof that's not the case. And the other one is access, right? It'd be really easy to say, like, I didn't have access. I was in undergrad in engineering school and hadn't been able to touch a computer. Yep. So I think those are both really just valuable and vivid illustrations of like, just because you are starting later than someone else, you don't have the same access as someone else, doesn't mean you can't go create amazing things.
Yeah, I agree. I'm biased, but I agree.
Yeah. Shifting over to HubSpot, was there a moment or a milestone that you kind of said, wow, like this isn't just a startup, we raised funding, but like this is a movement. This is something that really has staying power and impact on small businesses around the world?
some evidence early on that that this could be a thing, right? Because we built, and for those that are not familiar, HubSpot, the company that I founded, now it's been 17 years ago. We started in the marketing software space, and what was interesting there is we actually kicked off this movement this category called inbound marketing that didn't exist at the time, and this was in kind of reaction to what we thought was really crappy marketing that had existed for a long time, which is, hey, I'm going to blast the world with my messages. I'm going to spam them. I'm going to cold call them. I'm going to do all these not only less than desirable things, but also decreasingly effective. So what was kind of interesting about the HubSpot story is that movement actually sort of grew in parallel, and the product didn't exist, not really, right? So we kind of sparked that idea. It's like, hey, wouldn't it be nicer if marketing was a noble profession? Wouldn't it be nicer if we actually added value to the people we were trying to sell to? And now we take some of these things for granted. We look at the open source community, we look at product-led growth and things like that, which we should talk about. But it's like, how do I add value to the world? And that kind of pulls people in to my company, into my business, and that's where customers will come from. It's just a much better way to market. And so that we had lots of nodding of heads, and this is back when blogging and Web 2.0 and all those things were first happening. And then in terms of like the milestone around the product itself, it kind of grew relatively, I'll say smoothly, kind of oscillated around, right? And every startup has kind of the moments of near death, which we did too. But no kind of standout. It's like, oh, we woke up on a Monday morning and all of a sudden traffic went up 10x, or we got 8 times the customers. That never really happened. There was no kind of defining moments like, oh, here's the point at which we figured out that this is actually might be a thing. So
yeah, there's no in every fundraising deck, there's always the hockey stick. There was never that inflection point. It was just kind of the steady progression.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. It was funny. Like when we did our early fundraising, we actually refused to kind of draw out that hockey stick because we're like, because I say this a little bit cavalierly, but it's like startup pitch decks, especially the financial projections, are basically works of fiction, right? It's like layers of assumptions upon assumptions upon assumptions that really don't serve any purpose in my mind.
Yeah. So I am curious, HubSpot is, in addition to having its roots in marketing software, and I have to say, I first started using HubSpot back in 2008. I was a VP of marketing at a company at the time called UTest, and the alternatives were just cumbersome. They felt like they were built for Fortune 500, and even then, just really, really tough. I will also say that GitKraken is a voracious user of HubSpot's entire suite, from sales to support to marketing. So for what it's worth, we run our business on HubSpot.
That's awesome. Thank you.
And Dharmesh is not paying me to say that. He's not going to give me a discount either. But no, it is really a great product for not just small businesses, but growing, scaling businesses up to, frankly, very large companies. HubSpot was always a marketing juggernaut. As you mentioned, we kind of defined and created this category of inbound marketing. In the early days, did that make it more difficult to figure out the features to build in the product? Because marketing's kind of defined this and we have to live up to that. Or was it still just, no, product's going to have, we're listening to customers, we know what we're building. I guess what I'm asking was product direction impacted by being a category creator?
Yeah, the two, they didn't completely overlap, right? So, and this is both made it easier and harder at the same time, which is when you're creating yes, categories like the product category, and that's the thing marketers and folks like to talk about. But what we were really doing is creating a movement, right? It was not intended to be a product category. It was a new way to do marketing, which, then, and we made a couple of very deliberate choices when we did that, which is, okay, well, if this is like the new way to do marketing, which we think is right, and we got some validation from the world at large, we intentionally did not trademark the term, right? So we called it inbound marketing, which we made up. And we wanted others to use it. I mean, it's like, okay, if this is really going to be a movement, we can't own it. So this is a bit of an open sourcey kind of approach to category creation, which is the way to actually create a category is you can't be sitting out there alone talking about that category. That's not a category, right? And then too many people hug their new categories too tightly, and then when they have competitors, which was definitely the case for us, is that there's like, oh, we have an inbound marketing thing too, and we do this as well. It's like we thought that was great. The more people that adopted that idea, it's like our hope was that the pie would be big enough, the category would be large enough as a result of this, because we thought we were on the side of truth and justice, that everything else would sort of catch up over time, right? That was, yeah.
I remember during one of our first dinners, I actually asked if you and Brian co-founded HubSpot. Correct me if I'm wrong. You met at MIT Business School, and I asked, was there ever like the awkward conversation about, well, who's going to be CEO? And because that's a very natural thing, right? Everyone has pride and an ego, and your answer to me was just like astoundingly self-aware, and it wasn't humble. It was just really self-aware. And you said, no, we like, in fact, the only conversation was, I'm not doing that. Right. And there were a couple of other caveats that you had. Do you want to share those in terms of like, your responsibilities and being able to focus on being a builder?
Yeah. So we had, and I highly encourage, if you're ever starting a company or you find yourself, there's what I call the kind of ask hard questions meeting that you have with your co-founders, and you go through a series of things. And I actually have my list. It's like, okay, well, and early in the list is like, okay, who's going to be CEO? What are respective roles and titles going to be? Other things around dividing equity, other things around how do decisions get made. We can talk about those things. But on CEO, that was actually a really easy one, which is, and I told Brian, it's like, I don't want to be CEO. I've been CEO before and I suck at it. That's just not my thing. And he's like, great, because I've never been CEO. I want to be CEO. So that was like, okay, no argument, no debate. The second one took a little bit of discussion, which is my second thing was not only, and I actually made it up spur of the moment because this was not in my head going into the meeting. But once I said the words around the CEO thing, I'm like, oh, and also, I don't want to have any direct reports. And he's like, oh, okay. Like, no, I mean like ever. Like in the history of the company, like ever have any direct reports. And then, it's like, okay, Dharmesh, no, I like, Brian, I need you to look me in the eye, because there's going to be a day that our VP of engineering quits or something. It's like, okay, well, why don't you just step in as interim VP of engineering, interim, whatever it is, and run this team for a little while until we kind of find a replacement. That we are going to resist the temptation to kind of pull me in those circumstances. I don't ever want to have direct reports, because I don't think it's in the interest of the company, nor in my interest to do that. And I'm a very black and white, not the right term. I think binary decisions have a underrated value to them, right? Analog decisions, like, oh, I'm going to put this on a spectrum of things. It's like, okay, well, we're going to do this. We're going to limit the number or whatever. And then it's like the definition changes. But say, look, I'm going to have 0 direct reports is a very clear binary statement, right? And
a lot of gray area.
There's no doubt. There's no gray area.
Yeah.
And we've stuck to that. It's been awesome. And there have been times where, it's been tempting, but, and I think that was one of the other kind of very impactful decisions. And not to say that I'm not involved, I'm like 100% in the company, and I just go to where I think I can add value. And if I had not made that decision, I'm a startup-y kind of guy. HubSpot has 7,000 plus employees now worldwide. I would not have lasted, right? Like I would not have been happy at the company because I'm a startup-y guy. Like if I had kind of done the conventional path and had a team of 1,000 people that I was trying to manage, I just don't think that would have worked. So anyway,
it's an awesome example for me of initially self-awareness and being really honest with yourself and with your business partner, with those around you. But you're 17 years into it, and so it's also the discipline to not let it slide. Like you said, well, I'm sure there are plenty of times when, oh, there's a gap. Hey, maybe you could take this, this small group over here and go, run that, manage that. And so the combination of, self-awareness and like you said, kind of having to double click on that and say, no, I'm being literal, and I mean forever, not just to start with or not just for now. And then the discipline to stick with it, I think, is awesome. I think there are probably a lot of software developers who can really relate to and say, wait, I could be, a CTO, I could be a co-founder and not have the mundane one-on-ones and performance reviews and the very important responsibilities that often come with, are thought to come with leadership or becoming, that operator. And so I think it's really cool. One of the things that it seems to me that it's enabled you to do within the context of HubSpot is to go find things that you believe are really needle movers and passion areas for you. And, you know, one of them, and I'm going back forever, but HubSpot created something I think originally called Website Grader, and it has become more than just a website grader. But I think you told me that you actually like built the prototype on a flight from Boston to San Francisco. Like it was like, no, I actually hacked together. And I remember being incredibly jealous because I was a CMO at the time, and I was talking to your CMO, Mike Volpe, and he said at the time it was something like we get 40,000 free inbound leads a month. And I'm just sitting there going, wait, you get 500,000 free leads a year just because this thing? And then I found out that you had just, you know, it wasn't that you hired an agency and it was Dharmesh, you know, kind of had an inkling that this could be interesting, and then just said, I have the capacity to go and actually start putting this together. You know, more recently, I think you've done that sort of thing around the area of chat. And I think it started off as an inkling, an idea, and then it became a passion project. And I remember reading LinkedIn posts from you saying, I've been up at, 1 or 2 in the morning, just hacking this together. I'll have something that I want to share with you in a couple of weeks. How do you choose your passion projects?
It's a good question. So I tend to scratch my own itch, solve my own problem. So it either has to be like 0 degrees removed from me or 1 degree removed, either someone I really, really care about, someone like literally in my family. So in the website grader case, Brian and I were constantly looking at prospective companies' websites and kind of measuring to what degree were they good at marketing, right? Because that would give us a sense for whether they were a good candidate for HubSpot. And so, I would go do a view source and look at the HTML and say, oh, they're using some good meta tags. That means they sort of have some clue as to like what SEO is, right? So you have these kind of little kind of visible signals, right? And so then you would go look at their Alexa ranking. You would see if they had a social media presence. There were all these kind of signals you could look for. And then after like a few weeks, I'm like, well, this is kind of painful going to kind of 8 different things. I know how to do it, and I can show Brian how to do it. And it's like, it wouldn't take me that long. So the original version of it was just built for the 2 of us, and specifically actually built for Brian. It's like, Brian, stop asking me to do this. Here's a web page. Just type the URL in. It'll tell you things that I would have kind of looked up, and I don't have to go teach you how to go view source HTML and what tags you're looking for. So it kind of grew out of that. We don't have to
go one at a time.
Yeah. And so, most of the things that I'm a tinkerer. So if I find a problem or something that's just annoying me, right? So, the thing I did in between, we'll talk about the chat thing too, because I think it's fun, but I did, it's the first time I've ever developed a game, but I developed a Wordle-like game. I don't know if, I know that's been over a year and a half ago now that it was all the craze. But like, it was just bothering me that there were like certain features missing in Wordle, which is you couldn't play with friends, you couldn't have tournaments, you couldn't play across multiple devices because it maintained state on your local browser using local storage. And I'm like, well, that's just stupid. I'm going to go fix those things. And so I went and fixed those things. And now that game called Wordplay, wordplay.com, is crossing like 18 million users. There's got a daily active user base of like 25 to 30,000. And I haven't written a line of code for it in like 6 months now. It's just out there. Something people enjoy. Yeah. So
that's awesome. Beyond writing code, correct me if I'm wrong, I think I remember that, and this is several years ago, that you kind of set out on a mission to define not just HubSpot's present culture, but their aspirational culture. And I believe it's called the Culture Code. Similarly, so it's not just that you pick a technical problem, right? That is a people challenge or a people opportunity. Yep. Just tell me a little bit about that process. Was it kind of similar? That like, I'm scratching my own itch. I just, it's not clear to me what the culture, how we've codified it. And then how did you embark on that? Because it was not a Dharmesh went and wrote out a deck in a weekend. It was this very thorough, collaborative process. And the end result, if you haven't read it, just search for HubSpot Culture Code. Is that the right phrase?
Culturecode.com. Yeah.
It's culturecode.com.
Yeah,
of course it is. It's phenomenal for companies of any stage. But I'm really curious about the process. How do you kind of uncover, I want to work on that, and then think about the process, because it's one of the few instances where it's not about building a product or writing code, is really kind of connecting people.
Yeah, there's a fun story here, and I think it also, I always in the back of my mind as we're having this conversation, I have this little kind of gauge that goes off. It's like, okay, well, this is interesting, but will it be useful to the folks listening right now? So this is going to be both. So trust me.
Nice.
So here's how it went in the early years of HubSpot. The word culture, when I say early years, like probably the first 5, 6 years, the word culture had actually never been used. And I know this because most of our interactions were over email, and I went and did, and I have, we'll talk about this maybe later too. I have, anyway, we'll come back to that. So culture wasn't used. And then my co-founder, CEO Brian, he joined this CEO group of local CEOs, some big names, at the time. And so they would have these quarterly meetings. And he had been to one of, and I always kind of envisioned this as, they're going out into a field somewhere and holding hands and singing CEO songs and, talking about CEO issues, like group therapy for CEOs, which to this day, I'm not sure that's that far from the truth, candidly. But at this particular, there was one meeting where the topic and the theme was culture. And everyone was going around the circle talking about lessons learned on culture, what they're doing about culture. And then when it came to Brian's time, Brian's like, oh, we're still in the very early stages. We're still trying to build a product. We've got customers to sell. We're like, we've got like, that's a thing we aspire to hope to solve like someday.
Right.
And his CEO friends came down him pretty hard. Like, Brian, you don't get it. Like, if you don't get culture right, nothing else you do will matter. It's just a matter of time. So like, culture will define your long-term destiny as a company. Mm-hmm. That's just what it is. So it's not something you put off till later. It's like now. All right. So Brian files that away. And then he and I have one of our co-founder meetings, which is usually 3 to 5 hour dinners involving multiple bottles of wine. And he tells me, it's like, oh, I just had my CEO group meeting. I'm like, awesome. What did you learn? He's like, oh, the topic was culture. Like, great. And he's like, and so he repeats like, it's like, well, Dharmesh, like culture is super important. It defines the company's destiny. Right. I'm like, wow, that sounds highfalutin. And who am I argue? And then the next line is something that will stick with me is, so like, why don't you go do that? And I'm like, I'm not sure what you mean. He's like, culture is like, it's super important. Why don't you go do that? I'm like, Brian, you've like known me for a while now. We've been working together. Of all the people in the company that it's like least qualified to work on culture, you realize I have no direct reports. I'm like, I don't know a lot about culture, but from what little I do know, it involves people. And that's not my thing, it's like, that's not my, like, anyway. So, but I was team sport. I'm like, okay, culture important. Got it. So let's figure it out. So I did the first thing, which is like, I'm going to do a survey. And so here's a thought that I had. And this is the engineering, and the engineers in the room will love this. It's like, okay, well, what we're really saying is like, culture, I thought of as like an operating system. It's like, okay, if I could write like a Python program that made all the decisions in the company that defined like the rules of engagement, right? Like, what would I need to know? It's like writing a function like that would, and so that was the first, the V1 of it was if I could write a single function that measured the likelihood of success for someone joining HubSpot, what would the coefficients of that function be? We don't know the weights yet. Let's put that aside. What are the things that are correlated? So I went off and did surveys of the existing employees to try and triangulate. Anyway, and so V1 of it was a slide deck. It was 16 slides at the time that answered that question, that answered the who question. It's like, if we could like mathematically come up with a way to kind of measure likelihood of success for an individual, how well this person kind of fit our culture for whatever it is, because the culture was working, the company was doing well. And that's why, by the way, it's called the culture code. Inside story, which is most people, when they see that, they're like, oh, it's a code of conduct or a moral code around how companies should operate and the relationship between employees. No, it was like, if I could write Python code to run the company, here's what it would be. And this makes like the top 3 list of things I've learned. And so from that point forward, kind of the big epiphany I had is that really culture is actually a product. Yeah. And every company actually builds 2 products. They build one product for their customers, and they build another product for their people, for their employees. Yeah. And once you take that frame of mind, so let's just stipulate that maybe that's right. Let's just say, if you kind of pull on that thread, that's like, okay, well, you would never build a product for customers without asking the customers whether it was working for them or not, what the bugs were, feature. It's like, And so we did that. So every quarter, in the same way that we would get product feedback, we would get feedback from the employees who are the customers of the culture and say, oh, like what's working, what's not working. And then we would categorize it. We would talk about it at the all hands meeting. And we took that to the nth degree. So we treated those as bug reports. And there are times where it's like, oh, a lot of you have reported this bug in our culture or whatever, but that kind of works as designed. Like we're not going to fix that, right? Or yes, that's a bug, but it's a lower priority right now because these other things are much more burning issues, and we will solve these, within the next, 3 to 6 months. And that has been one of the most impactful kind of realizations that we had. And so yeah, I mean, I'll close this out. So one of the things that HubSpot is most known for outside of kind of inbound marketing and now CRM and customer platforms is our culture. That's the thing. And so that product is quite possibly even better known than our core product, right? It's weird how that's turned out. But if I could give one piece of advice and it doesn't even matter what stage of company you are, is culture super important. Treat it like a product. And if you think of it as a product, the one takeaway would be the mistake most startups will make and most startup founders and founding teams will make is they think their job around culture. It's like, oh no, we think culture is super important. And as long as we can preserve our startup culture, then we have won. That's what success looks like, is preserving our culture, not losing that. And I think that's misguided. And the reason it's misguided is that if you think of culture as a product, in the same way that a product is never done, you iterate on it because the needs of the customers will change over time.
Yep.
A culture is also not done. Now, you can have product philosophies that carry across product portfolios and across decades. You can have core values that are constant, but the actual culture and the way it manifests will likely need to change over time, needs to be iterated on. Anyway, thank you for coming to my TED Talk on culture. But
well, I'm going to extend your analogy. You said, people can report bugs and it might be, yeah, that's a high priority bug, or it might be that actually works as intended. I'll extend the analogy. There's also feature requests, right, that come in over time. And I love you calling it a roadmap. We talk about culture in the last couple of years, at least since I joined GitKraken, in the same way that it's a product. It is a living, breathing thing. And if it's not tended to, it can decay, it can erode. And by the way, the culture that we have today won't serve us well 2 years from now, as the company grows, as the portfolio grows, as our responsibilities and opportunities grow. Yes. And so I will echo what you said, thinking of it as a roadmap, thinking of it as this ever-changing, living, breathing thing that requires time and attention. There's debt that needs to be paid down. There's bugs that need to be fixed. There's features and improvements and iterations that you'll go through. And the second that you set it and forget it, it begins to atrophy. And it's just like software. The earlier you catch it, it's easy to keep up. The longer you let it go, the more expensive and painful and harmful it becomes.
Yes.
Awesome. Shifting gears a little bit, we were talking about chat, and the name of the product in HubSpot is ChatSpot. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's ChatSpot. Okay. Yeah. ChatSpot is a natural language interface. It's a bot application. So think about ChatGPT, which pretty much everyone has seen and used. If ChatGPT and HubSpot had a baby, right? So it's like a natural language chat interface for marketing and salespeople to do marketing and salesy things, right? Through a natural language interface. And so once again, kind of given the audience on here, I think one of the biggest transformations we are living through right now as software developers and product builders is around, and yes, generative AI is super interesting. And most of the excitement around generative AI is like, oh, I can type a prompt in and get a 1,000-word blog post, or I can create content, and that's super exciting and super fun. I think the future opportunity is not having generative AI generate something for human consumption. It's having it generate things for computer consumption. And so let's dig into this just a little bit. So anyone that's ever built software, every company that's ever built software always says, to varying degrees, like, oh, we build easy, intuitive applications. That's our different, versus the guys from 10 years ago, or whoever it was. And that is fundamentally a lie. And the reason it's a lie, right, is if you just look at that word intuition, it's like, let's say you're sitting in, we'll pick any product of choice. Let's say Excel. Most people are familiar. It's like, oh, I want to take all the negative numbers in this Excel file and make them red if they're negative, format them a specific way. Like, you sort of have to have So you have your thing that you're trying to do with the software in your head, and then you have to go through a very specific set of swipes and clicks and touches and whatever. You have to sort of know the software and know how to do the thing you're trying to do. The thing you're trying to do is very clear in your head. It's like, I want all negative numbers to be red, right? That's the thing. Or I'm trying to build a report in HubSpot that shows me my sales last quarter from Europe, whatever it happens to be. And so that's not intuitive at all, right? It's like we're translating our intent as humans into the language that the software understands in some form of UI as the designers kind of created it. And so now for the first time, literally in human history, and I've tried this, by the way, I've been obsessed with this idea of like, okay, well, if we truly wanted to create intuitive software, we would allow the user just type in what it is they're trying to do, make all the negative numbers red, or create a report of sales in Europe last quarter, and then the software just does that. And now that is actually possible. It literally was not possible. I know this because I have tried multiple times to do this with machine learning technology and natural language processing, both open source and closed source, over the span of at least the last 6 years, if not longer. But now with generative AI, one thing that's kind of misunderstood is these large language models are really good at understanding human language, and that's great. But their output, both what they consume in and what they put out, is basically text. And it just so happens a lot of the training data that we use for LLMs is English corpus knowledge of, reading Wikipedia and the entire internet, all of human knowledge, and building a deep learning network. But it can also do other things, right? Which is generate code, because that's really what we're talking. So what ChatSpot effectively does to say, oh, let the user type in a natural language prompt. Here's what they're trying to do in HubSpot, let's say. Then use that to generate code. So imagine if you had like 1,000 developers at your beck and call, Matt. It's like, oh, here's the thing I want to be done within HubSpot or whatever applications you're using. And they were super fast and they were at your beck and call. They would go write a piece of code, and they were super fast, so it would be done in like 5 minutes. And then you'd run that code. And that's essentially what ChatSpot is, right? It'll take the natural language query in, generate in our domain-specific language. It'll make the right API calls to HubSpot or wherever it needs to go to pull the data together, reformulate the response back in a way that's going to be meaningful to you, and say, here's the thing you asked for, right? And across every industry that there is in software right now, this is the big transformation. This is the big opportunity. It's as big as moving from client server to the web when we move to browser-based applications versus things that lived in your client. This is going to be the next thing, in my mind. I mean, it's going to take years. Some industries will move faster than others, but it's a massive opportunity for everyone listening.
You've written a lot about chat as the UI of the future, the interface with software. Do you think that extends across spaces? Is that, specific to, a certain type of applications? Or do you kind of see that, like, the GUI, the point and click, I have to type things in, starts to be supplanted or even improved upon by chat as the interface?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So I think chat is going to augment user interfaces and user experiences, right? So there's a lot to be said for these kind of natural language chat-based interfaces. And the examples, I gave you were somewhat contrived, right? Because they happen to lend themselves well. It's like, oh, it's hard to do it, but it's very easy for me to express it in my head. But there are a class of problems for which a traditional visual UI is actually more meaningful. This is particularly like you're trying to discover something, you're doing, you're trying to kind of find your way through a particular body of knowledge or whatever. There's certain things where the visual interface makes much more sense, because then you can do sort of like a guided, because the issue with chat is you have the blank canvas syndrome. You don't even know how to formulate the thing you're asking for, right? It's like, whereas, UIs have been designed with an onboarding experience in mind that says, oh, when you start, we're going to help you become accustomed with the software, just like games work, business applications, same thing. Right. And so over time, I think we're going to see a hybrid. We're going to see more and more natural language embedded inside classic UIs. And they will help you do the things, because some things will be easier just to express it, but then some things will be easier kind of rendered in a visual UI, or kind of and this is sort of what ChatSpot does with like report building. It's like, oh, you can describe the report you want, but then we're going to put you into the HubSpot report builder to fine tune it, because then it starts to get annoying trying to type. It's like, okay, well, you're asking me to pick amongst these things, whatever. Like, I don't even know what the choice of options are. Well, we've solved that problem. There are these things called drop-down lists where I can just tell you the constraint and here are the things you should be choosing from. And that's a much better overall experience than trying to force someone to kind of guess at what the actual word is. So English is great for lots of things, or natural language is great for lots of things, but not everything. So I think we're going to move towards this kind of augmentation model, but I think more and more will recognize that these are things that are easier for the user than actually in some ways. A message to the kind of product managers out there and the builders and the founders is that one of the nicest things about on the kind of building side of it of chat UX is around the ability to experiment really quickly. So let's say you have a new feature idea, it's like, oh, here's this idea that occurred to me. And the idea itself is actually not that hard to implement, right? It's like, okay, we get it. But once you have a UI, like an actual UI in the mix, you have to go then design that UI. There's lots of degrees of freedom. It's like, okay, well, what should we ask for? How's this laid out? And now you have a whole other person that has to be involved in that process. With ChatSpot, like we get requests all the time, and that's like product management nirvana, right? It's like I know what people want to do in ChatSpot by virtue of just looking through the logs every night, right? It's like, oh, here are the things and here are the patterns of they want to be able to do this. And that's a reasonable thing to be able to want to do in ChatSpot. We don't do it yet. Let's go do it. But then you can implement it, right? It's like, oh, I don't have to design a UI. I can say, here are the 5 ways someone might express that.
Right.
Then you give them an example inside the app and say, oh, by the way, we support this now. Ask questions like this. And here's a sample prompt of us telling you SEO research or whatever. Here's a way to express that. And people use it like in 24 hours, you can do something that would have taken like weeks, right? If you had to go through the classic design a UI, roll out the UI, figure out whether it's working. How do you solve the discoverability problem? It's like, oh, you just tell them.
Right.
You don't have to worry about gating or anything because it's like, okay, well, if they don't know about the fact that that prompt is even supported, you can just send an email to a small percentage of people and say, oh, by the way, try this prompt, right? Like that's
you don't have to put it behind a preview flag or like an insiders group.
I haven't been this excited since like V1 of the web in the late 90s, right? It's like, this is, really? I went through mobile, as we all did, went through the social thing, and it was good, right? Don't get me wrong. That was awesome. Sure. Uber gave us lots of great applications. But this is like a tear in the fabric of the universe level kind of evolution, right? It's not just because it can write a blog post or whatever, just because the primitives that it unlocks are just so profound. It's like, okay, well, and now we're just starting to discover, it's like, okay, well, anything that can be represented in a textual form, these large language models can consume. Music. Like, in Western style classical music, you can represent music as a series of letters with annotations, sharps and flats, and that's it. That's the vocabulary of music. Right. And there's a large body of music, and we've already done this now, right? It's like, oh, I'm going to index every piece of music that ever was. I'm going to classify it into genres. I'm going to then be able to generate music that sounds an awful lot like music that's been, but is actually original, right? And so you would never have thought that a large language model would be able to produce music, but it uses the exact same technology that we use to generate a blog post.
Let's take the conversation around generative AI and bring it into the world and present and future of software development. What type of impact do you think that AI has on software developers and software development as we go forward 1 year, 5 years, 15 years?
Yep. So the impact we're already seeing is around improving developer productivity. So if you're not using a product like GitHub Copilot, and there are other ones out there, you should be. It doesn't matter where in the evolution of whether you've been writing code for 30 years or 3 months, it works. This is not one of those fad like, oh, I can't believe that a coding tool, having coded for 30 years, that's ever gonna. It's like, yeah, I'm not writing like simple for loops that are gonna sort something or whatever. That's not what I do. Like, I do much higher falutin stuff than that. Like, no, it will improve your productivity, period. So that's like thing number one. Then kind of the next step from that, I think the thing we need to be mindful of is that so generative AI is going to change software development in a very fundamental way. And it's a little bit like, and this is sort of the kind of evolution of software development generally, right? We've been increasingly moving towards higher and higher levels of abstraction. We went from machine code to assembly to C to C++ to the interpretive languages. And there's certainly patterns to that, but the most fundamental thing that always seems to get better, and we take half steps back sometimes, but is to allow developers to work at higher levels of abstraction and being closer and closer to the problem versus having to deal with the intricacies of how a particular architecture or a particular language works. And so what I think generative AI is going to open up is a level of abstraction that we've never experienced before, which is, so right now, if you're in GitHub Copilot or something, like you're in your IDE of choice, whatever it happens to be, and you can like leave a comment, I'm writing a function, here are the parameters or whatever, and it'll take a pretty good pass at writing out the code for you, and you can review it, and that's all good. In the future, I think where this winds up is that we're going to have like multimodal development, which is we all know about writing functions in whatever language you're writing about, but imagine if like some of the code in your application was actually English, that you don't have to do code generation or anything. You just like, oh, here's a function that does this, and you just describe the function, and you don't see any code. It's just there. It's like when you use a library, like you look at the API of the library, but you don't really, unless you need to, dig into the internals of like what the implementation is. That's the whole point of having an API or having a layer of abstraction between you. So imagine a layer of abstraction which lets you articulate the thing you're looking to do in your natural language, whatever it happens to be. We'll use English for now. It's the most common one. So I think we're going to see that. And so that's going to be one kind of track of evolution. So we talked about developer productivity. That's going to continue to get better. You should be using it. We're going to see this kind of multimodal environment. The other one, I probably should have put this second, is around it's going to bring new people into the fold, right? And we've had conversations around like kind of low code, no code for decades, right? And the problem with all of the prior implementations of low code, no code is that they basically just swapped out kind of one manifestation of imperative code for another. It's like, oh, you don't have to write like an if block or a for loop or something like that. We're going to let you do it visually, right? Like, yeah, but I'm still having to think about conditional logic. I have to know what a loop is, and I have to understand scope or whatever it is, right? Yes, maybe it's visual, but it doesn't really take away, like, it's just code in visual form, I guess is what I'm saying. It's not no code, right? It's code in visual form.
It's a different learning
most
curve.
Of those implementations.
It might be a more accessible learning curve, but it's still a learning curve.
Yes.
Right. Whereas,
but now we're getting to the point where certain kinds and classes of applications you actually can do literally with no code, right? Like, okay, if it's a relatively known problem, we're seeing some early examples of this from the LLMs around like building simple games or simple kind of full-fledged but simple applications on the web that exists, and they may not get it right the first time, but it's going to get better. So what's going to happen is we're going to see new people come into the kind of software development arena, which I fundamentally think is actually a good thing for professional developers. And here's why. Because what it does is it kind of raises the impact we as kind of professional developers that have been, let's say, classically trained or empirically trained, it raises kind of the value that we can bring in terms of like, okay, well, the need to kind of understand problems, the need to kind of understand technology and how all this stuff really kind of works is going to be even more important, because we're going to see lots of noise on the lower end because lots of new things, people learning. It's like, okay, that's great.
Right.
But as soon as you get to like anything of scale, it's going to matter in terms of what the maintainability of the code is, or it's going to matter when you decide it's like, oh, we're going to build product number 2 in our portfolio, and how do we then like reuse some of the code from the thing that we didn't actually write? Right. All of that stuff is going to become important. Collaboration is going to be important. These kind of skills around not just being able to, and which has always been important. So it's not just about, in my mind, when you write code, the best developers, write, and this idea is not mine, but the way I'm going to say it is mine, is that the best developers write code not for the computer to kind of run it. Mm-hmm. It's for humans that will come downstream from them later, or your future self. Like, is it easy to understand? So don't write code that's going to be the fastest or uses the least memory footprint. That's the easiest way to kind of move towards obsolescence. Try to say, okay, here's the simplest, most elegant manifestation that's the easiest to understand for others and for me as to how this thing does what it does. And that is an art form. And yes, large language models will likely get better at that too, just in the same way they got better at writing. But that's the skill I think that we should still continue to learn, continue to teach the next generation, is around problem solving, empathy, being close to the customer, close to your teammates, in terms of like very few applications are created like as a single person solo effort, right? And they're usually team efforts.
Dharmesh, thanks so much for taking the time. Really great. I'm sure tens of thousands of developers around the world are going to get to listen in on this conversation and benefit from your learnings and your journey. So I can't thank you enough.
Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thanks, Dharmesh.
Best wishes.